Hi, and welcome to this live reading from The Last Dance by Lonna Enox, and this is hosted by Itsy Bitsy Book Bits. Prologue. "Better pay my tab," she said. "Have to work in the morning." She carefully counted out the exact amount, added a couple of coins for a tip, and climbed off the bar stool. Several patrons down the bar called by. She answered them as she walked unsteadily out the side door. Whew! She hadn't realized she'd had so many beers. Still, good music and good dancing made your throat dry. Good thing she could walk the short distance to her apartment. She shivered. It had been a warm day, but the night was chilly. She wrapped her coat closer as she walked along the well-lit parking lot. Maybe she should take the shortcut. The moonlight peeping through the trees would provide a shadowy stream of light to point her way down the dark alley. Besides, she knew every step of it, having taken it so many times coming home from work. She crossed the back parking lot and turned right. Only a few steps from the alley's entrance, she hesitated, thinking she heard a voice. Glancing over her shoulder, she saw two silhouettes, one standing in a car and the other standing at the car window. "Evening," she called, then squinted. "I didn't recognize you at first." She smiled. "Enjoyed dancing with you tonight. It's been a long time." She waited for a response. The one in the car touched the brim of his Stetson. "Oh, I didn't see you at first. Loved dancing with you, too." With a self-conscious wave, she turned and stepped carefully off the paved parking lot into the alley. Her shoes felt wobbly. She stepped into one of the tire ruts, and her heels sank into the soft dirt. She giggled. She really shouldn't have had that last beer, but it had tasted so good. Several dogs complained that she had invaded their alley. She smiled and waved to them, humming a country tune slightly off-key. Some nights she could sit all night and never get asked to dance. Tonight had been her lucky night. She remembered her mama saying that one Saturday night. Mama had let her watch as she dressed up and did her makeup that night and told her, "When you're big, you'll have lucky nights too." And then she danced off into the night with the current love of her life. She had never been in love. Maybe some people just weren't meant to make men's hearts flutter. She smiled. But for those moments they whirled you around the dance floor. You were their princess. She veered to the left a bit to avoid the large rubber dumpster. Why were those dogs complaining so much? She glanced back. She didn't know why, and then she smiled shyly. "Well, hi. Again." The blow to her temple came swiftly, and she collapsed with a soft grunt. She felt hands lifting her and smelled the sourness when she was dropped into the dumpster. Something warm oozed into her eyes. Her mouth opened, and she reached wildly out with her hands, but they couldn't stop the blade that swooped down and sliced neatly across her throat. Chapter 1. I should never have bought the newspaper. It's a habit I'm trying to break. What world news I want to know I can get on the internet or on television. When I give in to the occasional mood to show local interest, I end up clipping coupons that I eventually toss, reading the funnies, avoiding the obituaries, and skimming the want ads. But reading the newspaper seemed the best way to acquaint myself with this small town, something I considered prudent if I wanted to make it my home. I walked to a small donut shop, ordered a cup of coffee and a jelly filled, picked up a copy of the Sunday paper from the counter, and settled at a small table in the back. The waitress followed me, plunking down a cup and saucer and filling it from the coffee pot. "Cream? Sugar?" "Black," I said, and then bit into the gooey delight, my eyes closing to savor the sweet raspberry jam. When I opened them again, she had moved on, stopping all around the room to refill cups until her pot was empty. Apparently, this was a popular place on Sunday mornings. The room was now full. Several people were obviously dressed for church. Others wore jeans and sweats. Most everyone appeared to be regulars, chatting to the waitress and with others at the tables next to them. After living in a city of 2 million, this comfortable warmth reminded me of some of the small towns I'd lived in growing up as a military brat. After I'd licked the last trace of jelly from my fingers and the waitress had refilled my coffee cup, I opened the paper. The bold headline caught my eye. "Local woman discovers body in dumpster." Ordinarily, I would have scarcely noticed the headline. Violence is a daily event in large cities. but the large 2-column photo beneath the headline caught my eye. I had seen that woman last night. Terrible, ain't it? The waitress had returned and was glancing over my shoulder. She moved toward my cup, but I shook my head. Did you know her? I asked. No, but things like this don't happen here. Imagine that, dumped in the trash. Who ever heard of such a thing? She moved on to the next table before I could say anything else. I folded the paper, stuffed it into my fanny pack, and dropped a tip on the table. Come back, she called. I nodded casually. Right now, I just wanted to release the tightness in my chest. I scarcely noticed anything as I hurried back to the bed and breakfast, collected Flash, and turned my Jeep onto the highway. Chapter 2. The dead woman's face floated in front of me as I drove along the empty 2-lane highway. When I arrived at the house my aunt had left to me, I stared at its shabby, weathered walls, no longer feeling the happy expectation I'd felt when I first arrived in Saddle Gap. It hadn't taken long to brush against something that could wreak havoc to my plans. I'd arrived in southwestern New Mexico a week before last. The 3-day trip from Branson had become 4 because I'd had to become accustomed to driving my new Jeep, its back seat lying flat and loaded with the worldly goods I'd chosen to keep. It hadn't been as difficult as I first thought when I waved goodbye to my Mini Cooper. Of course, Flash hadn't agreed, yowling with displeasure from her hiding place under the seat. So I'd also taken more breaks to soothe her. The front part of the old house had been converted into a gallery and gift shop. Aunt Rose had been an amateur artist and a member of the local craft guild. Besides her own paintings, my aunt had sold craft items from the area to locals and tourists. The house perched on a few acres of barren land and had been the only house for miles when I was a child. Now, manufactured homes dotted the area, though none were too close. Located at the western edge of Saddle Gap, a small town of around 30,000 residents, the house and property had been virtually abandoned for the 8 years since Uncle Tom's death and Aunt Rose's move to a nursing home. I had come here when I was about 10. Aunt Rose had actually been my mom's godmother, but Mom explained that when her own parents died in an accident, Aunt Rose had come and taken her to Saddle Gap, where she'd lived until leaving for college. We had driven there at Aunt Rose's invitation. Mom and I usually took trips in the summer when she, a teacher, and I were both out of school. Saddle Gap had captured my interest at first sight, and the 2 weeks were hardly long enough to satisfy my curiosity about the town and its historical legacy, or to enjoy the fun of working in Aunt Rose and Uncle Tom's shop. So my mom had allowed me to stay for the rest of the summer. I'd thought of the place often, but had never returned after that summer. Mom hadn't either. She'd spoken of it, but a brain aneurysm had stolen her life in an instant just before I graduated. In spite of the years, I still felt a connection to the place, so when I received the attorney's notice of my inheritance, I'd been thrilled. Do you know what shape it's in? Kevin had asked. You'll put it on the market, of course, but they'll probably want you to clear it out first. Want me to handle it? Like you really have time to do that. Kevin was my husband, an oil executive who had never understood why I didn't give up my career and become a socialite like the wives of his colleagues. But that's a whole other story. I could handle it. But I'd not had a chance to do that until now, a whole year later, when I needed to start with a whole new slate for Flash and me. Just us. Alone. Searching the internet, I'd found a temporary spot for us to stay. La Paz Bed and Breakfast. When we arrived, I'd told the owner we would stay there about 3 weeks. That had been an ambitious estimate, but I'd welcomed the hard work. The weather had been sunny and warm for late March, and I'd felt sure I could be set up in business by the end of May. I'd spent all of the first week digging through the old house and hauling trash to the dump. It seemed as if my aunt and uncle had just walked away. Old bank receipts and letters filled the top drawer of the desk. Aunt Rose's clothes hung in the closet. His were neatly folded in the chest of drawers. Ancient cans of vegetables lined the pantry shelves. Dust covered the stack of outdated magazines and newspapers. Mouse droppings littered the floor. The shop, if possible, had fared even worse. Aunt Rose had apparently not been able to sell the remaining merchandise or empty the shelves. Spiderwebs edged paintings on the walls, some connecting to those close by. Handmade objects lay under coats of dust on the shelves. A lower window had been broken, most likely in mischief, and layers of dust had covered everything. It had soon covered me as well as I filled trash bags. By the time I tumbled into bed the first night, I'd had at least a vague idea of the cleanup facing me. Saturday morning, I'd headed to the local home improvement store. After stocking up on equipment and cleaners, I'd wandered over to the library nearby to look at back issues of the newspaper. If I planned to make this my home, better yet, if I planned to reopen a business here, then I needed to tap into the personality of the area. About 10, I dropped by the La Paz to collect Flash and the sandwiches I'd requested that morning. Flash had complained about being left in her carrier, but bites from my tuna sandwich had pacified her. After our early lunch, I'd unloaded more cleaning supplies and other equipment I needed to start the renovation. My first priority had been to fill more trash bags and then put padlocks on the doors. I'd nailed plywood over the broken windows and sucked cobwebs and dust from walls and floors with a shop vac. We'd returned to our room, exhausted but happy. But my photographer's eye hadn't missed the lizards and wildflowers, and I longed to get this work finished so I could grab my camera. Flash had listened to my chatter, but she was a cat after all, so I decided after my shower to venture out for the evening. "You should try Bart's," the cashier at the convenience store where I'd stopped for gas on the way home had told me. "They have a live band. It's a bar, tavern they call it, but the food is great." Chapter 3. I'd arrived at Bart's shortly before 8 o'clock, already feeling fresher after a quick shower and a change into a loose denim skirt and sleeveless top. At first glance, the bar had appeared drab, certainly not a place I would ordinarily choose. Several patrons had already been seated at tables. I'd found a spot in the corner, away from as much of the smoke possible. The door behind me led to a dining room where a few people lingered over dinner. Within minutes, a cute waitress had appeared. "Name your poison, honey," she'd said. "Diet Coke." "You sure?" Her eyes had told me she wasn't used to serving Diet Coke at Bart's. My soda had arrived when the live music arrived. A singer who strummed the guitar, but who actually depended on one of those machines that have a whole band in them. "Hi, New Mexico," he'd called with practiced ease. "Hello, Joe." A gray-haired guy in a cowboy hat had nodded slightly from his place at the bar. During the next few moments, the singer had greeted several others, all the time clicking switches and setting up for his evening. Finally, he'd drawn his guitar into a close embrace. The room had hushed expectantly, and a second later he had begun singing the opening lines of a popular country western number. As singers go, this guy, who had introduced himself simply as Dave, had been nothing extraordinary. But his choice of songs and his easy commentary had been appealing to the crowd. Within seconds, the small dance floor in the corner opposite mine had filled with couples, two-stepping, or attempting to, as the watchers chuckled. I'd spent the next half hour just watching the dancers. Then I'd noticed her. She must have been on the bar stool in the corner when I arrived. But I had noticed her when the music started because she bobbed her head in a weird way, keeping time to the music. Occasionally, she'd taken a sip from the long-necked beer bottle in front of her, bobbing at the same time. But she'd never looked at the dancers, only straight ahead into the bar mirror. Besides the bobbing, her outfit had caught my attention. Most of the customers in this bar had worn some form of denim. She'd worn a floral cotton dress and an old school jacket, the kind you might have seen in the 60s. Her hair was light brown and frizzy, either from natural curl or a perm. I might have pitied the sight she made had she not been so comfortable there, oblivious to the rest of us, nodding to the music. Several times during the evening she had danced with men who were obviously regulars there, but she hadn't seemed to be with anyone special. She hadn't been an outstanding dancer, but she had certainly kept up on a two-step or a waltz. Her expression, even as she danced, had been worth remembering. She'd had a sort of smile, not a smile of mirth, but a sort of pasted smile. Whatever could have happened? When I left about 11:30, she'd been on her stool, drinking a beer. Chapter 4. I pulled into the driveway, noting that I had to get it resurfaced, and stopped close to the back door. "All I need is to get caught up in some murder investigation, Flash," I told her. She peered warily out of the pet carrier at her future home. Clearly, her look said what I needed was to return to my senses and drive us back to Houston. "Better open a can of that cat food just as soon as I get you inside," I crooned. Flash buried her face in the food dish, her dainty manners abandoned in her attempt to comfort herself. "It will be better," I told her. "Trust me." I hoped I wasn't lying. I changed into faded shorts and t-shirt, trying to remember if I'd given my name to anyone last night. Had I used a credit card or made any other casual mistakes that could lead to me? I just wanted to be a casual stranger, catch my breath, start my own business, and live a quiet life. The news article faded over the hours as I vacuumed cupboards and closets before scrubbing them with lemon-scented cleaner. Even though most places were open on Sundays, I didn't plan to shop today. Instead, I jotted down ideas, things that needed to be checked, and supplies for the things I could do. Flash insisted we leave at sundown. After eating, feeding Flash, showering, and snuggled into the bed, I unfolded the newspaper and reread the story. Her name was Stephanie. She hadn't looked like a Stephanie, I mused. I tried to conjure how she might have appeared to a young mother. Her last name was Brown. Maybe her mother had wanted to liven up the last name, Stephanie Brown. Apartment C, 21st Street. She had lived alone. Neighbors remembered her as quiet, unassuming, nodding a smiling greeting while never meeting your eye. She'd paid her rent on time, had no visitors, and had worked as a housekeeper in the same motel that housed the bar where she'd danced a couple of nights a week. She'd been 32. Somehow I'd thought she was older than that. Still, I hadn't gotten a clear close-up look at her, just the occasional neon snapshot as she danced along my side of the small floor, and the long-distance view from across the bar. I really couldn't help the police. What could I possibly add to their investigation?